Good morning. Indeed, I did not go to Hillsdale College. I regret, but I've been associated with it for a long time. My wife did go to Hillsdale College, and it's created a great marriage. It gets more interesting, however. I went to Claremont, which is in California, great undergraduate institution. Unfortunately, it's been going the way of most institutions, becoming more and more liberal. At the same time, Hillsdale is becoming stronger. My wife now works for Claremont, and so she's an academic with Claremont in Washington, D.C. I've been in Washington about 20 years or so now. Most of the time, I've been at the Heritage Foundation, where I worked for a long time. Great institution. Now at a greater institution, Hillsdale College. And I've been involved in the movement and working with various institutions and other groups in Washington, D.C. And so I have to say that even though he's not here, my dear family friend, Morton Blackwell, has built one of the important institutions of the conservative movement. And we can't fail to recognize what these institutions, and this institution in particular, does for the long-term good of our country. So I was going to talk this morning a little bit about all the presidential candidates, but we decided at breakfast there are just too many of them, and we don't have time to go through them all. So instead, I was going to give you a few thoughts about what I think is kind of going on in the country more broadly, and what we might think about all that. I think one of the reasons why there are so many presidential candidates right now is that they see an opportunity. I suppose that's the positive argument. An opportunity to an open field, no designated candidate, no front runner. And so more and more people are getting into it. But I also think that one of the reasons why there are so many candidates is there's a lot of confusion out there. There's confusion about what we stand for, what conservatism means, what America means, but also perhaps more importantly, what to do about it. And that's not merely a difference of policy. It's not merely a difference of positions. It's a fundamental difference about how to think about those important questions. Let me begin with a story. In my books, I like to tell stories because stories, especially historical stories, are great ways to make a point that sometimes we don't quite understand. One of the stories in my book that I like to use is a story about a young man named Levi Preston. Levi Preston was a young man at the time of the American Revolution. He lived in the outskirts of Boston, Massachusetts, in a little town called Concord, Massachusetts. If you recall, the British occupied Boston, and they left that occupation to go out and find munitions that were being stored up by revolutionaries, the rebel, out in the hinterlands. To get there, they passed through Lexington, where the first shot is fired. And then from Lexington, they moved to Concord. And at Concord, they came across a small group of these rebels at a small bridge. If you've ever been there, it's actually quite small. One of the people at that bridge was a fellow named Levi Preston. As it so happens, a few years after the Revolution, Preston is interviewed by a historian, one of the rare interviews we have of someone at the scene. And the historian asked him why he fought at the Battle of Concord. It's a very good question when you think about it for a moment. The British Army of the day was the most heavily armed and best trained military force known to man at the time in world history. The forces in Boston were some of their best. And they sent out from Boston a very heavily armed, 1,000-plus group, some of them mounted, the Hussars who led the charge with their big, large black hats to scare the enemy as they approached. They had heard shots had been fired at Lexington. And now here they stood at the Concord Bridge, a small number of them, less than the amount of people in this room, with guns they had gotten from their parents in the French and Indian War. So the historian asked Levi Preston, why did you do that? Was it because of the tea tax? You objected to the tea tax. And Preston said, no, That didn't bother me that much. I didn't drink tea myself. Well, it was the Stamp Act. You objected to the Stamp Act, is that right? No, that didn't bother me that much. I didn't really, kind of ignored it. Well, how about all those books you read? Surely you read John Locke and Harrington and all the important books on Republican theory. No, I didn't really read those books, says Preston. I read the Bible, the Psalms, the Farmer's Almanac. And so the historian at this point is getting frustrated. Why did you go? Why did you fight? This was assuredly your death. Why did you do it? And the Preston turned to the historian and said very simply, well, you see, we had always governed ourselves. We intended to govern ourselves, and those redcoats didn't think that we should. And that was the end of the interview. I've come to the conclusion that simple interview really encompasses and grasps the meaning of America. There are many things about it we can think about. One thing is that as I tell that story, inevitably, even to those uneducated crowds of high school students who don't study history, as I tell that story, they nod their heads. They're familiar enough with it that they know what's happening. Oh yes, Lexington, I remember that. They were warned. There was that guy named Paul Revere. You see, they have, the audiences, including yourselves, have something that Levi Preston didn't have: hindsight. You know what happened. What makes that a powerful story is Levi Preston didn't know that the shots at Concord Bridge, the shots heard round the world, according to the poem, were the beginnings of the American Revolution. He didn't know that, let alone know that they would defeat the British and found the American nation. Stories like that remind us of some very important things. One is that it's in those circumstances when the most important decisions are made, and outcomes are not obvious. It depends on the individual, what they know, what they believe, and how much they're willing to stand up for. The other thing it reminds us is that history is almost exclusively, the important things especially, about turning points. And the interesting thing about turning points is you don't know you're in a turning point until afterwards. Washington crossing the Delaware, all the things we study in the books. They're turning points. You turn history in a different direction by your actions and your decisions. I think it goes without saying, as others have recognized, but I want to emphasize today that we're in a turning point in the life of our nation. I think it's a more important turning point than most of us think. It's not merely about this election or that election, this candidate or that candidate. It's a more fundamental moment. And the key thing is we don't know what's going to happen. I cannot tell you with any confidence what will happen. I cannot tell you the outcome. I cannot tell you whether we will succeed or not. But the terms of the debate have been set. I think we're in a period of time, given events, given recent events especially, but events over the last decades, culminating in activities today, especially in the modern executive and the modern Supreme Court, we're in a time in which a new form of government is being created, a new way of governing, unlike that laid out in the American Constitution. And it's come to the point where it is on the verge of overwhelming the American people. Whether they realize it or not, they are less self-governing than they were just a decade ago. And that amounts to this overused word, crisis, which, when you look it up from its Latin derivation, is a crux, a turning point. And I think we're at a point where we need to decide as a people whether we're going to continue to be self-governing or whether we're going to be subservient. That, I take it, is the crisis, and I would suggest that is an opportunity. It's a challenge for conservatives and those who would like to do something about it. It's an opportunity for clarity, for speaking with confidence and a robust and revitalized conservatism that is united in its arguments about what to do. But to know what to do, we first need to know what we're dealing with and what we stand for. The thing about America that is different about any other country in the world, we talk about American exceptionalism now, it slips off our tongue, but it's a very serious point, a very fundamental point. There's something different about this country, which is that it's based on a set of principles, claims of moral truth. We see them written most famously in the Declaration of Independence. We have a creed, as Chesterton once said, unlike any other nation. We believe that all men are created equal, and they are endowed with certain unalienable rights. But these ideas stem not from merely the minds of Thomas Jefferson or somebody else. It's not merely parchment written on paper. It's said to come from the laws of nature and nature's God, a phrase which in turn comes from Blackstone, by which he meant what is taught to us through revelation, but also what we observe through the very nature of things, which is to say, it gives us a mooring for our politics, a fundamental, firm foundation. It's out of that foundation, because if we're all created equal, the only way to proceed, if we're equal, none can rule the other, none is born with a saddle on his back, as Jefferson liked to say, quoting Sidney, none is born with a saddle on his back, and none is born booted and spurred, ready to ride. We are fundamentally equal. The way to proceed is consent. If it's a principle of consent, you then have to decide and design a framework by which to have that consent play out in politics. We call that a constitution. The British had no written constitution, still don't have a written constitution. One reason why the British, once they start changing their traditions, are in a much worse position than we are, my friends. They have nothing to go back to. We have our Constitution, and behind the Constitution we have the Declaration. What we have lost more than anything else today is the fundamental link between the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Too often today we look at the Constitution, and I say this about liberals and conservatives across the board. Today we view the Constitution as a legal document, something that lawyers deal with. President Bush, very famously and disastrously, in my opinion, once said when he was confronted, I can't even remember which piece of legislation it was, is it constitutional? I don't know, he said. We'll let the Supreme Court decide. If you recall, when the current Speaker of the House was confronted with executive actions that he objected to, what did he turn to do? We'll sue him. Let's go to court. Excuse me. We have a tendency to see the Constitution as a legal, technical document. As a result, we look for silver bullets, easy fixes, quick solutions. Oh, there's this little forgotten phrase and a clause that we're going to use to save the country. But of course, that's not the way it works. The left ignores the Constitution altogether. Part of the deep crisis we're in. Right? I'm extremely bothered by, and I have to be very honest, I think the recent Supreme Court decisions about Obamacare and marriage are extremely problematic. The Obamacare decision, perhaps even more so than the marriage decision. The marriage decision is patently absurd. It has nothing to do with the Constitution at all. It's all about dignity and other phrases. It's not even penumbras and emanations. It leaves the Constitution entirely. The Obamacare one is more problematic. Right? The way it operates, the way it reads the law, the way it reconstructs the law, the way it legislates in the form of constitutional decision-making. The implication of that for the rule of law is very problematic. But it doesn't help if we, in turn, try to fix the problem by looking for technical solutions. There's a very important debate to be had in the legal community, within law schools, within courtrooms about originalism and how to read the Constitution. Other institutions, preeminently the Federal Society, have done a great service to this country by reviving that argument. I worked for Ed Meese for many years. But that's a legal argument. It's a courtroom argument. It's an argument for the courts. It's not the best political argument. Politics is about persuasion and deliberation and argument. The solution today is not in the courtrooms. The Supreme Court is not going to save us. The executive is not going to save us either. Electing a better president, a more conservative president, a preferable president, is not going to solve the problem. There are many legal questions that the president can't fix at this point. The idea of putting a president into the executive office and he can turn everything around is not going to happen. The solution to our problems is the old solution. It's the hard solution, but it's also the easiest and most apparent solution. It's what I like to call the Madisonian solution. The American founders designed a constitution of 3 branches of government. They have coordinate powers. And what do? They compete and fight with each other. They check each other. One of the greatest problems we have today is the complete and utter collapse of legislative power. This Congress, not just this one in particular, but Congress over some time, has lost any of its muscle to do anything. As a result, the executive is running rampant. Why? Not because of this particular individual, but because Congress has given away so much of its power to the president. He has so much executive authority, so many administrative powers. One can make a very good argument, which he does to some extent, that he is merely administering what he has been told to do, but has now come to the point where it's clearly outside of the rule of law. And then on top of that, the legislature, with the executive, has turned all the hard questions over to the Supreme Court. And so now the executive administers and rewrites and edits laws, and the Supreme Court legislates itself. That's the dilemma we face today. I think the most important thing for us to do is to re-educate ourselves, to think seriously about what constitutional government means. It's not merely giving a few speeches and quoting the founders here and there. I can tell you as someone who's written about this and is called upon many times, the thing I hate to get from a member of Congress or a governor or someone is give me a few quotes I can use in my speech. That's not good thinking. What we need to do is teach ourselves and more of the American people how to think constitutionally, how to use the framework of government to advance the deep fundamental principles we believe in, which happen to be enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. How do we preserve those things? How do we conserve those great liberating principles? That's what we need to do to save this country. We need to learn once again how to think prudentially. Prudence, the cardinal virtue of the ancient thinkers, the cardinal virtue of the founders, is something we increasingly have lost. Now we fight to see who is the most perfect. It's always about purity. Now, in many cases, those fights are good fights to have. Don't hear me wrong. Sometimes you fly the flag, but other times you think prudentially. What do I need to do to get something done? I'll come back and get the rest later. Remember Ronald Reagan. If I can get 80%, that's great. I'll come back for the other 20%. We've forgotten how to think prudentially. And part of that is we've forgotten the link between fundamental principles, which you don't compromise on, which you uphold, and the other things, the practical application of those principles, where you can deal and make compromises in light of those principles. And the best place to do that, the best place to get that leverage is where? The legislature. The courts can't do it because they deal with absolutes. When they make a decision, it in theory applies to everyone equally. At least that's the modern way of looking at the judicial power. And when executives do it, they do it through dictate. The way to accommodate and move politics through persuasion and deliberation is by legislating. Again, something we need to revive. I'll also make a last point about this idea of fusionism. The argument of fusion in modern conservatism is that, well, we have different forms of conservatism. Let's figure out how we can all get together, get along, and build a movement. I think that's a weak argument, in my opinion. What I would appeal to is what I would like to call a higher fusionism. A fusion that understands all the various elements of modern conservatism, but in turn does it in light of higher principles. And that model of fusion is found in the American founding itself. If you want to find someone who's a good free market economist, who's writing at the same time of Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, published 1776, read some Alexander Hamilton. If you want to find moralists who believe in biblical creation and God's creation on earth and what we do about it, you can read virtually any of them. If you want to find national security hawks or national security individuals who are, believe in strength but also believe in moderation, you can find them there too. What kept them together? It was a fundamental and deep commitment to a set of principles which they believed were written on the human heart by the hand of God. I challenge anyone who likes to talk about the differences between Hamilton and Jefferson and all the other founders to find a place where they disagree on the most fundamental questions. They disagreed on policies, they disagreed on what to do in particular circumstances, but on the most important things, they were fundamentally in agreement. And that's how they abided and fought a revolution and won. There were long periods after the Declaration of Independence and after the war, of the revolution, when everyone around him was telling George Washington this was not going to work. We have failed. We can't govern ourselves. Washington never despaired. You cannot find a letter in which he despairs. He says, I don't know what to do. He appeals to Madison and others. What are we to do? He never despaired. And together they found the way forward. And when they did, he wrote in one of his letters, I now see where to go, and it is bright to me as the meridian sun. That's statesmanship. Statesmanship is understanding the deep fundamental principles, never doubting the meaning of those ideas, but adapting and being flexible about how to apply them. And when understanding what to do, doing it unfailingly. That's what we need to relearn today. That's why this institution is so important. That's why Hillsdale College is so important. That's why forming the character of the individuals who will be good citizens and future leaders of our country is so important. Thank you.